Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are here for day two of the Pride Study Wrapped, our Research Year in Review 2024, part of our 4-day extravaganza. Thanks so much for everyone who's come back from yesterday to rejoin us. Welcome. And if you're new here, welcome as well. We are so grateful to have you here with us. So just a quick note on our title of the webinar. Wrapped is a play that maybe you've seen, a play on words that some streaming services have used, gives you your highlight of your past year in a wrapped. Does not mean wrapped that we're done. We're not going anywhere. Just like our queer, trans, LGBTQI plus, sexual and gender minority community, we are not going anywhere despite any efforts to try to erase us. We take care of us. And I'm so humbled and appreciative of everyone to be co-creating this community space today together, and especially in this moment. So this new webinar series that today is a part of was launched really to create more opportunities to share back research results from the Pride study. We wanted to make sure that we shared research results back with other researchers, community organizations, and importantly, with community members and participants. And we're looking to build more touch points for researchers and community members to be able to engage with one another. I'll quickly introduce myself. My name is Daniel Moretti. I use all pronouns with positive intent, and I'm Program Management Director at PrideNet. A brief visual description of myself is I have brown curly hair, a mustache, light brown skin, and I'm wearing a blue and yellow turnout. It's a traditional Filipino long jacket with butterfly sleeves. It's my pleasure to introduce our co-directors for Pride Study and the Pride Net, Dr. Mitchell Lunn and Dr. Juno Abedin-Maliver, who are going to provide brief welcome remarks.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Hello, everybody, and welcome to day two of the Pride Study Wrapped Research Year in Review 2024. My name is Mitchell Lunn. I'm one of the co-directors of the Pride Study, along with Juno, who's also on screen today. Hi, Juno. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm a cisgender gay man who's white. I have brown, spiky hair, wearing a, light red sweater today, and I have brown facial hair as well. Wanted to thank you all for joining us today. We're very proud of and thankful for all the collaborators that we've worked with over these years, some of whom you'll hear from during our 4 sessions this week, one yesterday, today, tomorrow, and Thursday. And since our first paper in 2019, we've now published 71 papers and look forward to this continued productivity for the years to come with our ongoing commitment to engage and partner with LGBTQIA plus communities all along the way. With these communities, especially our trans and gender diverse communities now under specific and directed attack, we need each other now more than ever. So thank you all for joining us today, and thank you for your continued support, participation, and dedication to making the world a better place for LGBTQ plus people. Back to you, Daniel.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate the words, Mitch, and thanks so much, Juno, for being here with us today. All right, and so just a brief run through of the agenda today. We're going to be hearing 2 different double features from 2 amazing researchers. We're going to first be hearing from Dr. Nguyen Tran about experiences of conversion practice by race, ethnicity, and gender, and then a larger kind of follow-up to think about conversion practice and mental health among LGBTQI plus adults. And then we have Nicholas Panyanouvong, who is going to be sharing experiences with remote biological sample collection among LGBTQI plus participants to provide a foundation for what biological sample collection is. And then we'll drill in a little bit deeper to look at a study of willingness of Black and Hispanic LGBTQI plus communities to donate biological samples. And then you're going to want to make sure that you stay till the end. We'll have some updates, some new activities that are coming that we're going to share in our closing remarks. So a brief content notice, wanted to make sure that everyone was aware that at times some of the studies that are being presented may include sharing data around experiences of trauma. So we encourage everyone to practice self-care in the way that is most supportive for you. We also are having the slides available for everybody. We have them in the link that my colleague Alex just posted in the chat. If you want to pull out a smartphone and zap the QR code, you'll also be able to get the slides there. We'll also be recording the presentations. So if you signed up for any of the webinars, you'll be able to get the recordings for all the presentations, as well as we'll include this link to the PDFs of the slides, and we'll share out the resources that were shared in the chat as well. So before we dive into the presentations, just wanted to also provide a little bit more context about who we are. So we're going to start with PrideNet, and we are a national network that catalyzes LGBTQIA plus health research. It's great to see. I see in our attendees list, there's many who are from our national network that are here. So huge shout out and snaps to you all. And the way that we catalyze LGBTQ health research together is connecting community members with ways to participate in trusted research, but also creating opportunities for community input to inform all stages of the research process. You can learn more about PrideNet at the link that was posted in the chat from Alex as well. And so PrideNet provides community engagement for multiple studies. We're really focused today on the work that's being done from the Pride study. So the Pride study is based out of Stanford Medicine, same with PrideNet. And we are very proud to be the first national online and longitudinal or long-term health study of LGBTQIA plus physical, mental, and social health. And as you can see from our presenters, our co-directors, myself, this was really created by us and for us. So created by the LGBTQ community and for the LGBTQI plus community. And participants, really what their main focus is completing one survey that's online once a year so we could study your health over time. You might be invited to also participate in other surveys or studies depending on your health experiences, lived experiences. Our eligibility criteria is anyone who identifies as a sexual or gender minority, part of the LGBTQIA plus community, at least 18 years or older, lives in the US and its territories, and comfortable reading and writing in English. We are excited that we have an enrollment of 30,000 plus participants, but if we're missing you, we would love to have you. It's a great opportunity to have all the communities that you are part of represented in this very, very important data set. You can learn more about the Pride study in the link that Alex posted in the chat as well. Wanted to also share a brief video where wanted to really amplify the voices of our community network. And this is part of the series of new videos. So it's a new video from what we showed yesterday. This video today is going to be focused on hearing from participants in our network about what they see as the impact of the Pride study.
I believe that the Pride study is a really groundbreaking opportunity for folks to participate and amplify their voices, prioritize their own health needs, and better understand what is actually contributing to their own health outcomes.
A study that can lead us into the future by gathering all of our information, by synthesizing it, by really going in depth and having it be relevant to us.
There is power in numbers. The bigger the crowd, the bigger the voice, and the bigger the impact.
When our voices are heard and we're included in research from the start of the process, we can help so that the next generation may have better medical experiences and have providers who help them feel affirmed and become their best and more healthy selves.
It's so important that we participate in these kinds of studies. That's the only way our data can be incorporated into the research, and therefore the answers can reflect our needs and our realities.
We come from different places, we come from different cultures, we come from different families, regions, languages. And it's very important for us to count everyone, to listen to everyone's story, to learn and to know what other people are doing, what other people's experiences have been.
The variety of our communities is then put together in such a way that researchers can do studies and publish them so that those who read them can understand us better, can relate to us more easily, can understand and see our value to the community.
We all have different lifestyles, different journeys, and so taking that into account in research is really going to help improve health outcomes and improve any disparities that the LGBTQ plus community is currently facing.
We all benefit. Once the truth is there and demonstrable and in a place where it cannot be ignored, then we have no place to go but up.
Well, a huge thank you to our community network, all of our participants, everyone here today. Some of the folks that you saw featured in the video are with us present on the webinar as well, so sending a lot of love to you all. So it is my pleasure to introduce one of my amazing colleagues, Dr. Nguyen Tran, who is going to start us off with sharing more about two of their research. I'm going to go ahead and get the slides queued up and invite Dr. Tran to go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Daniel. Hi, everyone. I can't see you, but I can feel your energy from where I'm at. Thanks for being here today. My name is Nguyen. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the biostatistician at the PRIDE study. I am a Vietnamese cisgender gay man, and as a visual description, I have brown hair. And as a visual description, I have brown hair, I'm wearing glasses, and I have a blue shirt on. So I'm excited to share some of our work today. This first study, which is the first of two related studies, focuses on the experiences of conversion practices by race, ethnicity, and gender. Next slide, Daniel. Thank you. So to get us started, let's define what we mean by conversion practices, sometimes called conversion therapy. So conversion practices refers to the organized attempts to change or suppress a person's sexual orientation and/or gender identity or expression, and it specifically targets LGBTQIA plus individuals. Now, these practices operate under the false premise that being LGBTQIA plus is something that needs to be changed or corrected, which is why we have tried to get away from the idea of it being a therapy. Next slide. So some examples of conversion practices include talk therapy. So these are facilitated in a mental health setting, or religious rituals. Next slide, please. And the main thing to note about these different examples of conversion practices is that they have been widely discredited for not having any therapeutic effect. Again, being the reason why we have chosen to frame these practices as conversion practices rather than conversion therapy. Next slide. And in fact, what we see in the data is that they have been shown to cause significant harm to LGBTQIA plus people. To put this into perspective, research shows that people who have experienced conversion practices are twice as likely to have suicide thoughts and 2 to 4 times as likely to attempt suicide compared to those who have not. Next slide, please. We also have some data on how many people are affected by conversion practices. So among LGBTQIA plus people, 8.5% have reported experiencing conversion practices, but this number varies widely, ranging from 4% to 34%, depending on a number of different factors, such as one's self-reported gender, race, and ethnicity. Next slide. So when we break down this information by gender, we see that 4% of cisgender individuals reported experiencing conversion practices compared to 12% of transgender and gender diverse individuals. And then looking at race and ethnicity, we see inequities as well. So 8% of racial and ethnic minority groups report experiencing conversion practices, while 5% of white individuals report experiencing conversion practices. And so these numbers suggest that marginalized communities may face additional pressures when it comes to these harmful experiences. Next slide, please. So we have some idea of how common conversion practices are in LGBTQIA plus communities, but we still have questions about why some LGBTQIA plus people are more vulnerable to these harmful experiences than others. Next slide. So first, we have less information about the age in which LGBTQI plus people first experience conversion practice. Next slide. Second, we also don't have a lot of information about the time between a person's first and last experience with conversion practice. Next slide. And last, we don't have a lot of information about how these experiences differ by race, ethnicity, and gender. And so it's important to fill in these gaps in our research because factors like racism and transphobia can shape how LGBTQIA plus groups experience conversion practices, which are not only unethical, but also relate to mental health concerns like suicide. So this research that we have proposed can help to provide data to inform legal protections for LGBTQI plus communities against conversion practices, as well as understand the ways that we can tailor local policies to support groups within LGBTQI plus communities. Next slide, please. So to do our research, we started by including over 9,000 individuals that participated in the PRIDE study between 2019 and 2021. We also made sure that everyone in the study provided a response to the questions on race, ethnicity, and gender. Next slide. We then looked at the lifetime experiences and health questionnaire, where participants were asked to recall their experiences with conversion practices. They reported whether they had ever gone through conversion practices, the age when they first experienced it, and the age when they last experienced it. And based on this data, we use different statistical methods to calculate the percentage of people who experience any conversion practice, the age of their first experience, and the time between their first and last experience for the overall sample, as well as how these experiences differ by race, ethnicity, and gender groups. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of results, and I'm going to show some of the main highlights in this presentation, but I'm happy to talk more about them after in the Q&A. So first, we learned that 5.7% of participants reported any experience with conversion practices. Next slide. On average, participants first experienced conversion practice at the age of 18. Next slide. And their last experience with conversion practice was at the age of 21. Next slide. And this resulted in a time difference of about 3 years between their first and last experience with conversion practices. Next slide. We then looked at the percentage of participants who reported experiencing any conversion practices broken down by race, ethnicity, and gender. And you can see from this chart that conversion practices differ across these groups. Conversion practice were reported more frequently among transgender and gender diverse groups, specifically among American Indian or Alaska Natives, as well as Middle Eastern or North African participants. Next slide. We also looked at how these experiences, specifically their age of first experience, differ by race, ethnicity, and gender. Next slide. So when we looked at the age at which participants first experienced conversion practice, we can see that among cisgender participants, those from Asian, Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander, Black or African American, and Latin American or Hispanic groups all reported first experiencing conversion practice at around 20 years old. Next slide. In contrast, we saw cisgender participants from a multiracial background experience conversion practice at the age of 15. Next slide. And for transgender and gender diverse participants, we found that American Indian or Alaska Native participants, as well as white participants, reported first experiencing conversion practice at around the age of 19. Next slide. And for transgender and gender diverse participants from Asian, Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander, Middle Eastern or North African, and Latin American or Hispanic backgrounds, all of these groups reported first experiencing conversion practices at around the age of 16. Next slide. And so if we were to look at the full spectrum of the age when people first experience conversion practices, we can see that transgender and gender diverse groups often experience conversion practices at much younger ages. Next slide. So what does this then mean for our community? So first, we hypothesize that systems of power and oppression, including racism and transphobia, likely shape differences in conversion practice experiences across LGBTQIA+ groups. So LGBTQIA+ residents living in states without legal protections will face greater vulnerabilities to conversion practice if state and federal officials fail to act in banning conversion practices. To put this into perspective, the William Institute approximate that more than 20,000 LGBTQIA+ youths will likely be affected in states that do not ban conversion practices. And so all of this evidence suggests a need for a federal ban and local policies to support LGBTQIA+ people. Next slide. So before I wrap up, I just want to take a moment to express my gratitude for the co-authors and their collaborations, and to all the participants of the PRIDE study, as well as the PRIDE Net team for their support. For anyone who's interested in learning more about this work, I provided the links to the community-friendly summary as well as the original study. Next slide. And I'm happy to take any questions. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Nguyen. Really appreciated you sharing more about this really impactful study. Also, the links to read the community-friendly summary and the manuscript are in the chat, thanks to our colleague Alex. I'm going to go ahead and jump in. There are some questions. I'm going to also invite anyone in our audience today. Feel free, you could add your questions either in the chat box or in the Q&A function. So a question that we received was, is it right to assume that for cisgender people experiencing conversion practice was based on their sexual orientation, and for the TGB people, it was based on their gender identity? Or for some of the TGB people, was it also for sexual orientation? And then some gratitude. Thanks.
Oh, no, thank you. That is a really great question. And we actually go into that in the next study, in which we had additional follow-up questions about the types of conversion practices that people in different gender groups may experience. But the TLDR to that is what we saw was that trans and gender diverse groups experience both conversion practices to sexual orientation and gender identity. So for some people, it was only gender identity, but for some people, they reported both sexual orientation and gender identity. We also see for cisgender people that was also the case, but it's just that the instances in which people reported conversion practices specifically to gender identity were fewer than trans and gender diverse participants.
Thanks so much. We have a couple more questions. So do you know how many individuals participated in conversion practices with licensed therapists versus religious providers, self-help groups, and non-licensed individuals?
We do. Again, we report that in our follow-up work. So the short answer to that is we saw that for conversion practices focusing specifically on sexual orientation, they were more often reported in religious settings. And then for conversion practices specific to gender identity, they were more often reported in mental health settings.
Thank you so much. Really great questions, and thanks so much for providing these really thoughtful responses. The next question is, what constitutes a conversion practice?
Thank you for the question. So that's a really good question. There's a lot of debate on that. And so that's why I wanted to start the presentation with defining what it was so that we're all on the same page. And so for our work, we used a very specific definition that they are organized attempts, meaning that so the instances that someone may have with perhaps a parental figure in their life, with a one-sided comment or a remark, we didn't specifically fit within our definition of conversion practice. So we defined it as there is structure, there's organization behind it, there is a protocol in which someone might follow. It is persistent, meaning that it happens over multiple times, and it's just not one instance. And so those are some of the specific contexts related to how we think about conversion practices. Now, conversion practice fits within a larger umbrella of efforts to change someone's gender identity and sexual orientation. And so when we use that broader term, those instances where it's not necessarily attempts that are organized and structured and persistent, those instances would then fall under that larger umbrella of efforts to change someone's gender identity or sexual orientation. But here we use a much more specific definition of conversion practice.
Thank you so much for that. And our last question before we move into your second study is, someone said, I was wondering if researchers have explored whether age of first conversion therapy has a relationship to age of coming out. I appreciate your presentation.
Thank you. So to my knowledge, not yet. Or I guess to my knowledge, I'm not aware of a study that has looked at the relationship between age of first exposure to conversion practice to age of first coming out. There could be a relationship there, but I am not aware of any studies currently that have looked at this.
Great. Well, thanks so much. And thanks everyone for your great questions. Please continue Q&A in the chat. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Nguyen for our next study.
Great. All right. Thank you again so much, Daniel. So moving on to this next presentation. So this study builds on some of our previous work to examine the relationship between conversion practices and mental health among LGBTQIA+ adults. Next slide. So in the last presentation, we went over some key data points about the harms of conversion practices. And I just wanted to quickly go over them again before we move forward. Next slide. So first, we have evidence that conversion practices are related to suicide. So research shows that people who experience conversion practices are twice as likely to have suicide thoughts and 2 to 4 times as likely to have attempted suicide compared to those who have not. Next slide. And the second important data point that I previously presented was that both past research and our own studies show that transgender and gender diverse people experience conversion practices at higher rates across racial and ethnic groups. So next slide. So therefore, the question we asked ourselves was, what additional knowledge do we hope to gain by studying the relationship between conversion practice and mental health in the PRIDE study? Next slide. Well, the first thing that we wanted to learn that wasn't reported in some of these past studies was that it didn't distinguish between the types of conversion practices, so whether they target a person's gender identity, sexual orientation, or both gender identity and sexual orientation. Next. A second related point, so since past studies have not separated out these different types of conversion practices. We don't have a lot of information on how each of these types affect mental health in different ways. Next slide. And finally, we also don't have much information on the different contexts in which these conversion practices take place. So this would include things like where these practices happen and who is involved in carrying out these practices towards LGBTQI plus people. Next slide. So to do our research, we included over 4,400 individuals that participated in the PRIDE study between 2019 and 2020. And we also made sure that everyone in the study provided a response to the questions on conversion practices as in the Lifetime Health and Experience questionnaire. Next slide. Next, we linked participants' data to the annual questionnaire that they filed in the following year. So, for example, if someone participated in 2019, we then linked their data to the 2020 questionnaire. So this gives us some, this allows us to ensure that we have timing between when people reported conversion practices versus when they reported their mental health outcomes. And from these questionnaires, we were able to ask participants questions on mental health, right? So symptoms of anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, as well as suicide. And our analysis then looked at differences in these mental health symptoms for different types of conversion practices. Next slide. Again, we also had a lot of results for this study, so I'm gonna show some of the main highlights. So the first thing we learned was that conversion practice targeting only sexual orientation was the most common, affecting 3.4% of participants. Conversion practice targeting only gender identity and those that targeted both were each reported at 1%. Next slide. Next, we looked at how severe mental health symptoms were across different types of conversion practices. So this chart shows scores from 4 different scales that looked at symptoms of anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, and suicide risk. The colors here that you'll see is to compare groups that have experienced conversion practices to those who have not. And so shades of green mean lower levels of symptoms, showing that their mental health is more similar to those who have not gone through conversion practices. And shades of red mean that these groups experience higher levels of symptoms, indicating that they are experiencing more severe mental health symptoms compared to those who have not experienced conversion practices. And so you can see for this first group, this is the group of individuals that have not experienced conversion practices. And to put these numbers into perspective, we see that even among this group, these scores suggest that participants may have some indication for symptoms related to some of these mental health challenges. Next slide. And so when we start looking at differences for people who experience conversion practices, we see that when we look at scores for conversion practice targeting only sexual orientation, the scores are slightly higher than the scores for people who haven't experienced conversion practices. Next slide. And these scores were much higher than for participants who experienced conversion practices that only targeted their gender identity. Next slide. As well as conversion practices that targeted both gender identity and sexual orientation. And so you can see here that experiences with conversion practice that targeted only gender identity or both gender identity and sexual orientation resulted in participants reporting some of the most severe mental health symptoms. Next slide. And when we model these differences, we found that conversion practices, specifically, again, for only for gender identity and for gender identity and sexual orientation, had the most enduring effect on symptoms of depression, post-traumatic stress, and suicide risk. Next slide. So we also looked at how these relationships would differ by gender. And overall, we found that there were no differences for anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress. Next slide. The only difference that we saw was when we looked at how conversion practices targeting both gender identity and sexual orientation differed for cisgender versus transgender and gender diverse participants. And the main takeaway from this slide is that our results suggest that the association was stronger for cisgender participants than transgender and gender diverse participants. Next slide. So while we're not completely clear as to why there is a difference, we hypothesize that one potential explanation for these results might be due to the fact that transgender and gender diverse people who are most impacted by conversion practices may not want to participate in the PRIDE study, and thus we weren't able to include those participants in this study. Next slide. And the last data that I'm going to show for this presentation here is to look at who is facilitating conversion practice and where do they occur. So as you can see from this chart, conversion practices targeting sexual orientation mostly took place in a religious setting. So this is the chart on your left here. But for conversion practices targeting gender identity, they were more likely to happen in mental health settings. So this is the chart on your right. And so this shows that they're contextually, the setting and who is facilitating conversion practices may differ between these types of conversion practices. Next slide. So in synthesizing, this work, we found that conversion practice is harmful for LGBTQIA people in many ways, beyond what was previously described as it related to suicide, because we found evidence for depression and post-traumatic stress as well. Conversion practice creates a harmful environment for LGBTQIA plus people that may lead to delays for people in figuring out their identity, may lead to a sense of self-hatred about themselves, may lead to isolation and a negative self-image about themselves. And all of these can worsen their mental health. Our study also supports the idea that conversion practices are unethical and that arguments claiming that we need more evidence about cause and effect are misleading and not helpful. And really, what we now need is effective policy action at the federal, state, and local levels. Some of these actions may include educating families, religious leaders, and mental health providers, creating supportive networks for LGBTQIA plus youths, and supporting survivors of conversion practices. Next slide. So again, before we wrap up, I want to express my gratitude to my co-authors, all the participants of the PRIDE study, as well as the PrideNet team. The links for these studies are provided here. Next slide. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any of your additional questions.
Great. Well, thank you again so much. Nguyen, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the questions. So first question is, were the differences statistically significant?
Yes, particularly when we looked at symptoms of depression, post-traumatic stress, and suicide. For people who experience conversion practices targeting only gender identity, as well as for people who experience both.
Thank you for that. Our next question, were you comparing baselines prior to entry into conversion practices? So for example, were those saying no effects experiencing similar levels of symptoms to those with severe symptoms before those individuals received conversion practices?
That's a really great question. And the challenge with incorporating baseline or mental health symptoms prior to experiences of conversion practice is that in our previous study, we found that a lot of these experiences occurred for participants uh, before the age of 18. And and some of these, were as early as 9, 10 years old. And so we would need to then understand what their mental health were at this period in time in order to account for the baseline mental health symptoms in our analysis. That is something that we weren't able to do in our analysis, but we did conduct additional analysis to where we made some assumptions about what we think would be reasonable scores for their mental health during this period, and to see whether or not that would have affected our results or the interpretation of our results in any way. And we found that our results were pretty consistent, even when we assume different levels of mental health symptoms among participants prior to their exposure to conversion practices.
Thank you so much. Everyone, please join me in giving a round of applause, snaps, throwing lots of glitter to Dr. Nguyen Tran. Thank you so much for the really important research you do for and with our communities. We appreciate you taking the time to be here and sharing it out with everyone.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Well, up next, I'm excited to go ahead and invite our next researcher to present, Nicholas Panyanouvong. If you don't mind coming off, perfect, off of screen. Really excited for you to share more about the another double feature, the double two studies that you'll be presenting on with us today. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Daniel. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, well, hello, everybody. My name is Nicholas, or Nick Panyanouvong. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a second-year graduate student in epidemiology at Stanford who has been working with the Pride Lab over the past 3 years. And as a brief visual description of myself, I'm a cisgender Southeast Asian man with short black hair wearing a black jacket. And today I'm excited to present to you our research project entitled Experiences to Promote Biological Sample Collection Among LGBTQIA+ Participants. So first, I want to start with some basic definitions. Biospecimens refers to a sample of biological tissue collected for scientific or medical purposes. While the term biospecimens can refer to any biological sample, the most commonly collected biospecimens, especially in a research context, are blood, urine, and hair. Now, traditionally, when research teams call upon participants to donate their biospecimens, those participants have had to travel to a single centralized collection site, such as a major academic hospital or clinic, in order to donate their samples. But unfortunately, as you might imagine, this traditional method of collection can be really inconvenient for participants who live far away from the collection site and may have to take time off of work or other responsibilities to come in. That can be a really serious problem, especially given the fact that we here at the Pride Lab really want to ensure that the results of our research are generalizable to the broader LGBTQIA+ population here in the United States, not just here in the San Francisco Bay Area. So, given these challenges with traditional methods of biospecimen collection, the purpose of this quality improvement study was to really consider a novel method of biospecimen collection known as remote biospecimen collection. In remote biospecimen collection, participants in our research study donate their biospecimens at a collection site that is located much closer to their place of residence, such as a local clinic. Then, each of those various collection sites is tasked with shipping the biospecimen back to us here at the Pride study on the same day. This new decentralized model of biospecimen collection holds a lot of potential to really improve the convenience and the efficacy of the donation process, and thus make it easier for a wider range of people in the United States to contribute to our research. But given the fact that this is still a relatively novel method of sample collection, we here at Pride wanted to take some time to understand what's been working and what hasn't as much for our participants in this biospecimen research. And so here on the screen, you can see I've kind of laid out our study protocol for you. So everything starts when the participants who are eligible for a biospecimen study are notified of their eligibility on PrideNet. As a little bit of context, the study that we're going to be talking about today was one that was using blood biospecimens to examine how stress can drive epigenetic changes in substance use disorder risk. And I'm happy to talk about that study after the presentation. So after our participants were notified of their eligibility and went through the onboarding and consent process, our research team sent all of the materials needed for our participant to perform the blood draw to their place of residence. So this box contained things like ice packs, blood collection tubes, etc., everything that they would need to collect the blood and ship it back to us. Then the participant was tasked with bringing all of those materials to a local clinic where the blood was then drawn and packaged. And then the clinic was tasked with sending the biospecimens back to us, the Pride study, on the same day. After each of our participants donated their blood successfully, we asked each of them to fill out a short feedback survey following their participation to identify key areas of improvement for our study protocol. Once we'd collected feedback from our first 112 participants, we then performed a thematic analysis of their written feedback, and we ended up identifying 4 key themes: correspondence with the Pride research team, convenience, interactions with clinic staff, and anonymity and privacy, that really seemed to capture a lot of the major areas of feedback regarding our protocol and areas for future improvement. And so today I'm going to be walking you through some of those themes. So the first major theme was correspondence with our research team. So I've kind of divided the slide into things that participants really appreciated about our protocol, and then areas that they felt that there was a little more room for improvement. So first, starting with the positive, what worked? So our participants really appreciated the fact that they were able to obtain one-on-one correspondence with our study coordinators. So each of our participants in the study was provided with direct lines of communication, specifically an email address and a phone number, by which they could contact a member of our research team. And our participants really seemed to appreciate that. You can see one person said, "It was great that I got a call from one of the coordinators to walk me through what I needed to do." Similarly, our participants really enjoyed the transparency and thoroughness of the onboarding process. Our onboarding process consisted of a series of educational consent videos for participants to watch that really laid out what they would be doing and some of the ethical norms surrounding their consent and participation. And one participant said, "The transparency around consent made me feel comfortable being a participant in a study rather than just a number in a collection." However, at the same time, some participants had other varying opinions about the onboarding consent process. Some people, especially those who had been exposed to biomedical research before, said that they found the consent process to be somewhat repetitive and elementary. The next major area of feedback was related to convenience of our study protocol. And this is really important because the whole point of decentralized biospecimen collection is to make the process more convenient for folks. So there are a couple of things that participants really appreciated. The first was the ease of rescheduling, and this is closely related to the ease of communication with our study team. If there was any point in time at which participants needed to cancel or reschedule an appointment, they could just call us directly instead of having to deal with the clinic themselves. And so as one person said, "I had to reschedule my appointment and it was very easy to do, and I felt very supported." Participants also appreciated the fact that they were able to donate their blood at a clinical location that was familiar and comfortable to them. As one person said, "My location, which is already familiar with me from my general wellness blood work, was pretty easy to deal with." However, there are some areas for improvement with respect to convenience as well. So the main complaint that some participants had was that they felt that they shouldn't be responsible for transporting study materials to the collection site. Instead, a lot of participants indicated they would have preferred that we delegate and distribute all collection materials to the collection site, to the clinic, and so that they're ready when the participant arrives there. Some participants also struggled to find clinics that were close to their place of residence. Some had to travel at least a couple hours to get to the collection site still. And others found some difficulty finding an appointment within the limited hours. So because we stipulated that all blood samples had to be shipped back same day to us at Pride, That meant that our participants could only schedule appointments up to 1 p.m. And so all of the blood draws had to occur relatively early in the day, and that presented a challenge for some folks. The third area of feedback was related to interactions with clinical lab staff. So the vast majority of participants indicated that they had very positive interactions with the staff at these clinics. One person talked about how their lab technician was very friendly, respectful, and kind throughout the study. But unfortunately, there are still some areas for improvement. So the main issue that participants seemed to encounter was that staff at these various clinical locations had varying degrees of familiarity with the study protocol. As you can see here, one participant indicated that the lab technician at their collection site, quote, had no idea how the study worked and repeatedly asked questions about the study that they did not know how to answer. Another person indicated that they had a negative interaction with the staff at the front desk. They were turned away because the person working there had told them that they didn't schedule their appointment properly. And finally, some participants unfortunately experienced misgendering at the clinical location. One person said, "Employees stopped me the moment I came with my box in a full waiting room to misgender me completely." And finally, the last major area of feedback was related to anonymity and privacy. So participants really appreciated the fact that they were de-identified throughout the process, but unfortunately, some participants had to field a lot of unwanted questions from clinical staff. As one person mentioned, "I would have appreciated more privacy. The technician loudly asked the room if someone signed in as a study participant and then kept asking questions in front of everyone in the waiting room." Similarly, other participants, because they were de-identified, experienced some trouble navigating the appointment scheduling process when they were checking in at the front desk. So to conclude, while this protocol was relatively successful for many of our participants, there are several key areas of improvement. The first would be standardizing our protocol training across the various clinics that we partnered with to ensure that no one is encountering issues with lab technicians. The second would be making sure that we find ways of delegating study materials to the clinics and collection sites rather than leaving that as a responsibility for participants. The third is to keep pursuing avenues of personalized communication with study coordinators. A fourth option would be to consider as an alternative at-home collection rather than requiring participants to travel to a clinic. And finally, future researchers might consider partnering with established community centers in order to ensure that participants are really in an environment where they feel safe. I would like to thank all of my co-collaborators on this paper and all of our Pride Study participants, and I'm open to questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Nicholas. Really appreciated hearing about this really, I think, insightful study and the findings. I'll invite, if anyone has any questions for Nicholas on this study, please feel free to type in the chat or in the Q&A function. I'll go ahead and start us off with just a question from my end. Was there anything in your experience of conducting this study and doing the analysis? Was there anything that surprised you or that kind of stood out to you the most?
Definitely. I think for me, the main thing that really stood out were some of the concerns around privacy, which I found was, very, very closely related to this issue of standardizing our study protocol across different sites. So because our participants were often having to field these somewhat invasive questions about the purpose of the study or what they were contributing to the study, that often threatened confidentiality. And we also have to factor in that this is happening in a sometimes crowded clinical environment. As many participants noted, it was often in a waiting room. I think that poses a very special, particular challenge for LGBTQIA plus participants because we have to remember, in some cases, maybe participants are not out to members of their family or their immediate community and might have some apprehension about getting involved in this research to begin with. And so this can really compound that concern. And so I think that's why it's really important to consider alternatives. It can be challenging to standardize these protocols across so many different sites across the US. So that's why I kind of mentioned as one of my recommendations, really to consider partnering with LGBTQ plus community centers where participants know that they don't have to worry about fear of retaliation and that they can, be assured that their information will remain protected.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Nicholas. We do have a question that came through. One question was, how do folks find the continuity of care between the research folks and their medical teams? Are there any benefits for having a bigger village of people involved in care specifically?
That's a good question. So I guess one thing I would note is that in the context of the study, I wouldn't necessarily say that um, there was any degree of collaboration between our research team and the participants, like medical professionals or regular healthcare providers. So I wouldn't say that this study is necessarily well equipped to answer that question specifically, but in the context of biospecimen research more broadly, I would say that there are a lot of personalized health insights that a participant can glean from donating their samples, which can be very informative to them. And then they are welcome to share those insights with their doctor or their healthcare provider if they so choose. But we have a certain degree of compartmentalization. It's kind of our responsibility to maintain that degree of confidentiality with our participant samples and their health information.
Thanks so much for that, Nicholas. The next question is some gratitude. Thank you for your great presentation. And they said one of the quotes referred to transparent consenting procedures. Can you share some examples of it?
Definitely. So, unfortunately, I'm not able to share any of the video media that was involved with the consenting process, but that was, I think, mainly what that participant was speaking to. There was like a series of educational videos. Beyond that, we do have. So if you click on the link that was sent in the chat a couple of minutes ago, that paper does contain screenshots showing you, what some of the educational materials look like, kind of outlining like what the donation process would look like, what the participant needed to bring to the clinic, and whatnot. So I would say that a lot of that can be found in the paper.
That's great. And what you were referring to, Nicholas, I think really stood out to me. The team created videos that, showed who are the people behind the study, kind of talked through it. So that was some of the examples, I think, of the things that resonated with some of the participants and, having that a little bit more personal connection. So thanks so much for sharing that. Um, okay, the next question is the person says, I'm not sure if you could speak to this, but I'm wondering how big of a lift it was for this protocol to actually be implemented. It seems like a big undertaking to make this type of collection happen. Thank you.
Oh, it definitely was a huge cross-collaborative effort on our part. I'm not the most qualified to speak on this. I would honestly defer that question to other members of the study coordination team. Big shout out to Gowrie and Dr. Nusif Lenji. They were responsible for coordinating a lot of those efforts. But just even as a student working with the lab, I could just tell how much coordination was involved. We were constantly, especially because we were really prioritizing one-on-one communication with our participants. It meant that we really had to have availability to answer their questions, sometimes at all odd hours of the day when participants were visiting the clinic. So that was definitely a big drain. I would say, one potential area for improvement would be to have a broader team ready to field questions from folks. And then obviously the other big challenge, as you saw throughout a lot of the feedback, was that despite our best efforts to really outline a clear set of instructions and guidelines for the various clinics we partnered with, it was very difficult to enforce that standard. And there were occasionally errors, sometimes technicians didn't know what was going on and would ask participants questions. Other times there would be issues with the way they packaged the blood or shipped it back to us at the Pride study. So there were a lot of different hiccups that happened. And so I would just say yes, it was a very grand effort for sure.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Nicholas. And I would echo what you shared. And I think part of the goals with also conducting this study, but also in creating a manuscript and sharing it out, is to share the knowledge so that hopefully, other researchers, including, the Pride team, but others can, as we think about biological sample collection, thinking about ways where there are areas we can streamline, but understanding there's some areas where maybe that personal connection, that more labor intensive, it goes a long way. So hopefully, you all are able to take a look at the community friendly summary and the full manuscript. Just want to emphasize again, there's really great, rich details that Nicholas so kindly went over that can hopefully help to inform anyone looking to undertake or think about remote biological sample collection. All right, so thank you so much, everyone, for your great questions. I'm going to go ahead and invite Nicholas to do the double feature number 2, kind of digging in deeper around biological sample collection.
Okay. Well, hello again, everyone. Welcome to the second part of this two-part presentation looking at biological sample collection among LGBTQ plus communities. This second installment is very closely related to this first presentation you just heard about biospecimen collection, but this time we're more specifically examining the perceptions, attitudes, and motivations of Black and Hispanic LGBTQ plus communities when it comes to donating biological samples. So first, I want to provide a little bit of context. So historically, members of the LGBTQ plus community who also identify as Black or Hispanic/Latinx have had to contend with the dual forces of both systemic racism and queerphobia. More broadly, this is a phenomenon known as intersectionality, in which people who have multiple minoritized identities often experience compounded stigma and discrimination in their day-to-day life. Therefore, it is really crucial that biomedical researchers be intentional in learning more about the health challenges faced by Black and Hispanic LGBTQ plus people. Unfortunately, this can be exceptionally challenging because historically, biomedical researchers have exploited and mistreated members of these communities. And on this slide, I'm showing you just two key examples. So back in 1932, there was the infamous Tuskegee syphilis experiment. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this historical event, essentially what happened was that Black and African American men were enrolled in a study and infected with syphilis without their informed consent. And not only did that happen, but during the follow-up period of the study, the research team involved withheld treatment for syphilis from these participants even after it became readily available. And so this was a huge breach of bioethical and research norms and led to a massive overhaul in our standards for conduct and regulation when it comes to biomedical research. Then, in 1977, a series of forced sterilizations, especially among Hispanic and Latino women, in California came to light, and this also contributed to a culture of mistrust between members of Latinx communities and biomedical researchers and medical professionals, and was essentially a manifestation of eugenics. So, given these historic injustices, Black and Hispanic communities, understandably, have garnered a culture of mistrust when it comes to biomedical research and the medical institution as a whole. And therefore, in order to improve the representation of these communities within biomedical research, it's crucial that researchers take active steps to address this mistrust and forge relationships that are rooted in mutual trust and collaboration. Therefore, in this study, we wanted to take some time to understand what some of the major attitudes, concerns, and motivations are for prospective participants in biospecimen research among Black and Latinx communities. So we interviewed 22 participants in the PRIDE study about their attitudes towards biospecimen donation, and then performed a thematic analysis of those interview transcripts in order to identify 8 key themes regarding their attitudes and sentiments regarding donation. Those were community benefits, personal benefits, convenience, the perceived value of donation, community risks, personal risks, the trustworthiness of the research team, and the normalization of biospecimen donation. And I'll be going through those today. So first, community benefits. So many participants identified that participating in biospecimen research and donating their samples represented a very unique opportunity to advance the health of their communities. As one participant testified, the more information that we have about our community and the more research that's done, the better that healthcare in the future can be tailored to our specific needs. Along a similar vein, another participant talked specifically about combating the underrepresentation of their community in research. As one person said, "I'm the demographic that doesn't necessarily get attention in research literature." At the same time, participants also recognized that there were significant community risks involved in participating in research, especially biospecimen research. One participant in particular referenced the case of Henrietta Lacks and her cell line. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Henrietta Lacks was an African-American woman who was diagnosed with cancer, and when she was treated at Johns Hopkins Hospital and was biopsied, some of her cell lines were actually preserved without her consent by the medical team. And in the subsequent decades, that cell line was used to advance biomedical research and was often leveraged for commercial purposes by biomedical researchers. So as this person testifies, Henrietta Lacks' cell line now has sort of helped capitalism. It's healed a lot of people, but it made a lot of white folks rich. What is the balance between public good and corporate profit? Similarly, another person spoke on this issue of experimentation and unethical science. One person said, "I don't want us to be seen as nothing more than just something to be experimented on. That's something I do fear." And so you can see that a lot of these participants are really touching on this concern that their biological samples will be leveraged without their consent and not directly used to translate benefits for their own community. Now let's move on to the personal scale. So some participants felt that there were immense personal benefits to be reaped from participating in biospecimen research. A lot of participants felt that donating their biological samples had a lot of potential to provide personalized health insights. As one person testified, "I'm getting more access and awareness to my own genetic risks for specific kinds of diseases so that I can make informed decisions about my own healthcare." So this is kind of touching upon that question I answered during the previous presentation. People can learn a lot about their own health from participating. Another participant touched upon the monetary element. So they noted, "I'm 99% sure that I wouldn't have been interested at all in engaging in biospecimen donation if I didn't think I was going to be compensated fairly." So as I should note, all participants in biospecimen research here at the Pride Study are compensated for their time with a gift card. And so we really appreciate this participant's honesty in the fact that the financial compensation was a big deal for them. At the same time, participants also identified personal risks to participation, and a lot of this revolved around data security and confidentiality. So one participant noted that there is always a risk that your biological samples and your data, your personal protected health information, may be unduly shared with third parties. So one person shared, "There's the risk of any biological information being shared with health insurance companies, like sites, that can then be used to deny health insurance claims based on pre-existing conditions." Very similarly, another person touched upon this issue of data breaches. When someone has a part of you, you want to have best practices and you want to have the proper handles. Finally, another personal risk that some participants touched on was the fact that the actual process of donating these biological samples can be uncomfortable. As one person recalled, "When I'm getting blood drawn, I might get dizzy. It's happened a couple of times, and that's always a risk." The fifth major theme was related to convenience. So this is very similar to some of the analysis that we talked about on the previous presentation. So a lot of participants identified that finding the time in their day to donate is a major factor. One person noted, "I think for me personally, I wouldn't have an ethical problem donating biospecimens, but it's more about whether or not I have the time to do this." Similarly, another person indicated that if there was an option to collect their biospecimens at home, they would prefer to do that. At the same time, they also noted if there was an option to go to an office, they would also be able to do that. But however, they acknowledge that a lot of other people may not have steady work hours or work standard 9 to 5 jobs, and so having flexibility in the process would be important for them. Finally, some participants noted that the invasiveness of the biospecimen, so whether it was blood, tends to be more invasive, as opposed to something like hair, might be a major consideration, with a more invasive procedure making them less incentivized to participate. The sixth major factor participants identified was the trustworthiness of the research team. As one participant noted, "I can donate my samples to XYZ study that I don't know about, but then how do I know that they're not going to turn around and use that data for marketing or for a sobriety program or something that I didn't initially sign up for?" And this was a major consideration, especially because some of our biospecimen research right now is looking at substance use disorders, which necessarily carries a degree of stigma and therefore requires a degree of confidentiality. Secondly, many participants noted that the nature of the institution collecting the data was a major factor. As one participant noted, universities and other academic institutions have a lot of ethical standards that they have to abide by, and that might make the participant feel more reassured in donating their samples. And finally, people noted that the transparency and communication of the onboarding and consent process was a major consideration. As one person noted, "As a Black person, the last thing I want is to be in an experimental trial which makes me really sick, or in a non-trial where I get sick and the researchers knew there was a drug the whole time." The second to last major theme was the perceived value in donating a biospecimen. As one participant noted, "I probably wouldn't volunteer in this research unless I could see a real reason that my samples would add value. Partly, I know that the Pride study has a lot of information about my demographic. So if they reached out to me, I know they think that I'm going to add something valuable to the study by donating my samples. And so I think that this piece of feedback really highlights the importance of providing clear and transparent information to participants about how their samples will be used and what unique value those samples hold in contributing to the research, in order for participants to feel like they're really playing a critical role in the progression of the study. And finally, one somewhat surprising thing we found was that some participants felt that the donation of biospecimens had actually been relatively normalized during the COVID-19 pandemic. As one person noted, because of the pandemic, it really doesn't seem like a big deal anymore. It just seems normal. And as another person noted, I do this literally every week now. It's made it easier. It's really shifted in some instances the specialness of donating because you just do it so much now. You're specimening all the time. And I thought that was a really funny verb, specimening. So it just goes to show that maybe perhaps a silver lining here of this pandemic has been that folks are donating biospecimens more than before, and therefore contributing to this kind of research has been somewhat normalized. And so, as far as recommendations go, this qualitative analysis has really revealed the importance of transparency and communication with research participants, especially those from Black and Hispanic communities, during the onboarding consent process. Research teams should clearly communicate their objectives and discuss the intended community impacts of the study. And they should also seek to disseminate all research findings in a way that is accessible to community members. Researchers should also disclose all academic and financial affiliations prior to initiating the study so that participants have no qualms about potential ulterior motives. Research teams should also pursue high standards of security, especially regarding the maintenance of biological samples and genetic data. They should seek to communicate personalized health insights to participants following the conclusion of the study. And finally, the research team should seek to maximize convenience and provide compensation for all participants involved, especially for invasive procedures. I'd once again like to acknowledge all of my collaborators on this paper and thank all of our Pride Study participants and open to questions.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. This is just really, really rich, insightful data, and we really appreciate you sharing. I will once again invite attendees, please feel free to ask any questions you have in the chat or the Q&A function. I'll go ahead and get us started. In the last slide, you kind of shouted out the lead author on this study, our former colleague, Alexis Ceja. And I know you worked very closely with them on this paper as a co-author. Just wanted to invite you if you wanted to share a little bit more about what that collaboration looked like, what your experience was.
Definitely. So working with Alexis as well as the other undergraduate researchers at Pride was just a phenomenal experience. So essentially, we met every week to review interview transcripts together, and each of the members of our study team was tasked with coding a different transcript. And what that essentially means is reading line by line through what a participant has said and classifying various sentences or passages under certain categories for thematic analysis. And then we would kind of do this iterative process. We would seek to come to a consensus every week. And that was kind of how we went about the process. But it was just amazing to collaborate with such a diverse team. Everyone had varying life experiences, varying identities they brought to the table, and that really informed their interpretation of some of the transcripts and of what participants said. And so it was really important, I think, that we had that cross-disciplinary, multicultural perspective as we went about this work.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. And we just are so grateful for all of your collaboration and all the contributions you make as a member of the Pride Lab. We deeply appreciate it. I'll go ahead and ask the next question that came through the chat or through the Q&A. What are other possible solutions to the understandable fear and distrust from multiply marginalized and historically medically mistreated folks and the concurrent lack of diverse samples and populations in sciences and statistics?
That is a really good question. Also a very loaded question, I must say. So I think it's obviously very difficult to undo generations and generations of mistrust. I feel like during this presentation, I've touched a lot upon what we as researchers can do. But I think another, sphere where I think a lot of work remains to be done in garnering trust is actually within the clinical sphere. Maybe this is something I think about a lot as someone who aspires to attend medical school this upcoming fall. But I think that clinicians and healthcare professionals aim to play a very critical role in garnering trust and in fostering an environment where LGBTQIA plus participants and patients feel really safe disclosing their identity in the clinic room. And that actually really does feed into this issue of underrepresentation in research studies, because a lot of times what ends up happening is that at the doctor's office or in the hospital setting, demographic information like sexual orientation or gender identity generally are not even screened or asked by healthcare providers. There are still healthcare providers who believe that this information is irrelevant to the patient's note. And that has multiple consequences. One, it leaves the patient, unsure if this is a safe environment for them to disclose that information. And then second, it contributes really to this invisibility of these underrepresented groups in clinical research, right? Because if that information isn't being logged in the electronic health record, then it's not being fed into these clinical research databases. And so the domino effects just kind of carry on and on. And so I think one other direction I see really for combating this underrepresentation and really fostering trust is to really recruit more and more healthcare professionals to our cause and to ensure that conversations about sexuality and gender identity are taking place and in the healthcare environment, because it's a very critical part of a person's identity and their personal history.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing those insights, Nicholas. I think another resource that I'll share, I'm going to put in the chat. PrideNet, we convened 4 intersectional, sexual, and gender minority advisory groups. So we had an advisory group that was focused on Hispanic, Latinx, Latina, LGBTQI plus people, an advisory group focused on Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, LGBTQI plus people, another group focused on Black and African American, LGBTQI plus people, and then the 4th focused on LGBTQI plus people who are also people living with disabilities. And I put the link in the chat, we have a full set of reports for each separate advisory group that really talks about what are the recommendations they have around engagement, around research participation. And some of the things that, really kind of surfaced up for me and really echoes what, I think Nicholas shared is the importance of building trust. So they want to know that people of their own lived experience that are from their communities, they want to see themselves reflected in the research team, in the communications, in the way from that the study is designed, and also that it's coming back and benefiting their communities. We also heard a lot that they want to hear about like really transparently what is the process, who is behind the research, and also to acknowledge the historical and current harms that have been caused to each specific community so that it's really being transparent and really being upfront about that. So those are just a few things, that kind of surfaced up. So just highly recommend if folks are interested in that to take a look at the reports and the really great insights that those advisory groups have shared. So we have time for one final question. This came through. It says, how can individual 2S LGBTQI plus people, so outside of science, advocacy, medical positions, improve the current situation about research engagement? And here's a series of questions. Raise more awareness, question mark. Speak about their experiences, question mark. Take the rest researchers for a coffee date and questions.
That last suggestion I think is just great. Taking them out for a coffee date. That's always the best way to get to a person's heart. But in all seriousness, I would say, even if you're not formally in a scientific position or within the medical sphere, I do think that there's a lot an individual person can do in terms of, as you mentioned in this question, raising awareness about the research that's going on. So obviously here at Pride, we are community engaged. We're a grassroots initiative. We have ambassadors all throughout the country. And we're always looking for folks to get involved with our team and to spread the word of the work of the research that we do. And even as an individual LGBTQ plus person, there's a lot that you can do to inform your loved ones, those within your life who identifies LGBTQ plus, of the work that we do and to work to get them involved. So I would highly encourage everyone in the audience to help contribute to our mission.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. I co-sign everything you shared, and I love, 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 love seeing this question as, part of the team that's doing community engagement work. I think can't underscore enough the raising awareness and speaking about your own experiences. Sharing your story, right? They're hearing from peers about your experience, what motivates you to participate, what you see as the benefits. Um, that is just such a powerful form of storytelling and of community advocacy. That can be done on an individual basis, but if you're interested in, more formally doing some of that work, supporting, seeing how you can amplify efforts with PrideNet, we could go ahead and on the closing slides, we'll drop our email address, pridenetconnect@stanford.edu. Follow us on our social medias, amplify, share out. Really that, hearing from peers, hearing from your community about this and having it more spoken about and about, the power of representation and data is goes a long way. All right, well, please, everyone, join me in a big round of applause, lots of snaps, throwing glitter. Nicholas, Panyanouvong, thank you so much for all the great work that you do and for all of the research and being here to share back with us. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close us out with a couple of updates and announcements. Follow us on our social media platforms. We're at the Pride Study across Instagram, Facebook, and X. You can contact us at pridenetconnect@stanford.edu. Feel free to reach us out. Our whole team monitors that inbox, so we'll make sure that someone gets back to you. And also, Alex put a link in the chat. Make sure to sign up for the PrideNet newsletter. You'll get updates on webinars, online events, in-person events, resources when new research is published. So make sure to either scan that QR code or follow the link in the chat to sign up for the PrideNet newsletter. And then in closing, this is an invitation for you to join us. Maybe you're wearing both hats as a researcher and a participant, or maybe you're focused on one. For researcher collaborations, the link that Alex put in the chat and the QR code to the left, that will lead you to more information about how to go through the process of conducting an ancillary study, applying for an ancillary study with Pride Study. There's lots of information and details that are shared, as well as in the link in the chat. And then on the right, you'll see if you're interested, if you're not already a participant and you want to learn more about the Pride Study, what it means to be a participant, to have your health story told, click the link in the chat to register and learn more or scan the QR code. Huge thanks again to all of our presenters today, to the PrideNet staff that are in the background making this webinar possible, and the biggest thanks of all to our Pride Study participants, all of the attendees that joined today, and all of our PrideNet network for all the work that you do to advance LGBTQI+ health research. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.